How's it going, everyone? A very interesting poll came out in late August about what Americans consider to be a major threat. This poll showed some very significant and interesting differences between Democrats and Republicans in terms of what they consider to be a threat, how they perceive different threats, as well as some differences between Americans of different age as well. So we're going to go through this poll and point out some pretty interesting details. So let's get into it. So before we look at the breakdown by party and by age, we're just going to look at the overall picture. So we have the spread of false information online as the biggest threat or the biggest perceived threat, where 70% say it's a major threat and 24% say minor, 5% say not a threat at all. Followed in second place by terrorism, 61% call it a major threat, and the condition of the global economy, 60% call it a major threat. Pretty much a tie, 61, 60. Okay, so terrorism and condition of the economy are tied. And then below that, we have climate change with 51% considering it a major threat, and spread of infectious disease, 50% considering it a major threat. Again, 51 and 50%, it looks like it's pretty much a tie. What's noteworthy, though, is if you look at who says it's not a threat at all, you have 19% saying climate change is not a threat at all, whereas only 6% say that spread of infectious disease is not a threat. In fact, climate change has the largest portion saying that it's not a threat at all, 19%. Everyone else for not a threat at all, it's 6%, 4%, 3%, 5%. So for every category except for climate change, you have pretty much everybody saying that it is at least some kind of threat, maybe major, maybe minor. You don't really have a significant portion of the population saying it's not a threat at all. But climate change stands out here because it's the only one for which you have pretty much 1 in 5 people saying that it's not a threat at all. And so we see 3 categories. We have spread of false information way ahead at 70%. Terrorism and condition of the global economy are pretty much tied at 60-ish%. And then climate change and spread of infectious disease, it looks like they're tied at 50, but I would actually put climate change as the one people are least concerned about because of that 19%, because of so many people saying it's not a threat at all. Now, here is how that compares to the world. Okay, so this is from another study which looked at the whole world. Okay, so median percent who say each of the following is a what kind of threat to their country. So here we're not just looking at Americans, but across a number of different countries. And here we actually have its percentages or medians based on 25 countries. Okay, so spread of false information is around 70%. People do consider it a major threat, just like in the United States. It is the number 1 top spot. Then we have condition of the global economy is actually also at 70%, and terrorism is at about 70%. And climate change is just below, but also around 70%. So we see in general over many countries, people tend to be more concerned about condition of global economy, terrorism, global climate change than in the United States, where terrorism, condition of global economy, and climate change are significantly lower than 70%. But we do see a similar order, okay? We see spread of false information on top, then you have condition of economy and terrorism pretty much tied, and then you have climate change and spread of disease following, and that's the same thing we see here, right? We have spread of false information on top for the United States, terrorism and condition of global economy pretty much tied, climate change following, and then we have the spread of infectious disease. So in terms of how worried people are, Americans tend to be less worried than the rest of the world about different things, and that makes sense, right? America has a very strong economy. It's separated by 2 oceans, right? From the rest of the world, it makes sense that Americans would be less worried. But in terms of the ranking of what's more concerning, what's less concerning, the ranking is basically the same. In terms of what people consider not a threat at all, the numbers are all pretty low. Okay, again, 4, 5, 6%. But we do see climate change again as the largest category in terms of how many people don't consider it a threat at all. And that is at 9. Okay, not quite as high for the United States as where it's at 19. Okay, 9 is more comparable to these other low numbers. But it is noteworthy that both in the United States and in the world, climate change is the one where with the largest portion of people saying that it's not a threat at all. Now, it's important to keep in mind that when we're asking people, do you consider climate change a threat? You're not asking them, do you consider climate change as real? There's this misconception that some people have that the debate is between those who consider climate change real and feel that it's a threat versus those who consider climate change not real and so they do not consider it a threat. But there's also a very large group of people who do consider climate change real, but they feel like this is going to be a manageable inconvenience and therefore it's not a major threat. And that's a huge category. It might even be the largest category of people, and certainly for countries where climate change isn't considered a major threat. So it's important to keep that in mind. When we see these two categories, minor threat or not a threat at all, this includes people who do consider climate change real. They're just not particularly threatened by it. Okay, so moving on. Then we have the party breakdown. Okay, so this is very interesting, right? You have percent of people who say each of the following is a major threat to the United States by party. So it's broken down by party. So climate change really stands out here. Okay, this is where you have the most disagreement, okay, between the two parties. Among Republicans, or those who lean Republican, you have only 24% who consider climate change to be a major threat. Again, it doesn't mean they don't believe in climate change. They may very well believe in it. They just feel like it's not a major threat. It's manageable. But among Democrats, you have 78%, or those who lean Democratic, 78% who consider it a major threat. For Republicans, this is the thing they worry about the least of all the categories is climate change. For Democrats, it's pretty much tied with the thing they worry about the most. It's 78%, whereas the first spot would actually be 80%. So not only is it the issue with the biggest gap between Republicans and Democrats, it's also the thing that Republicans worry the least about, and it's the thing that Democrats worry pretty much the most about, tied with spread of false information. Then we have the spread of infectious disease. We have a smaller gap between the two, although still quite a big gap. Actually, for all of them, it's a pretty big gap, with Democrats worried about the spread of infectious disease more. And then we have the spread of false information online. So this is actually the number one issue for Democrats, okay, pretty much tied with climate change. It's the spread of false information online. For Republicans, it's the second top issue. So it's not surprising that both supporters of both parties care about this quite a bit. If we look at overall, this is the thing Americans are worried about the most, is the spread of false information online. And we see that among both parties, that it is quite a significant concern. What's interesting is they probably have a lot of disagreement as to which information is false, but they do agree that it is a major issue. Okay. Then we have condition of the global economy. Again, Democrats are worried more about it than Republicans. And then here's what's interesting about terrorism. Terrorism is the only subject on the list for which Republicans worry about it more than the Democrats. Okay? For every other issue, Democrats are more concerned about it. Terrorism is the only one that Republicans are more concerned about. That's pretty interesting. And not only are Republicans more concerned about it, it's the only issue that they're more concerned about, it's also the issue they're concerned about the most. Now, here's the interesting thing about this category, terrorism. Different people think of different things when they hear the word terrorism. It depends on who's the attacker, who's the target, what is the motive, what kind of attack it is. Based on that, some people might consider something a terrorist attack and others might not consider it a terrorist attack. So when you have Republicans and Democrats hearing the word terrorism, It might be that they're thinking of the same thing and Republicans just happen to be worried more about it than Democrats. Or it might be that they're actually thinking of different things when they're answering this question, and that could lead to this difference as well. Now, who knows which case it is? You'd probably need a more in-depth survey to find that out, but it's interesting that the category where interpretation of the question plays such a significant role is also the category that stands out from all the others in terms of that's the only issue that Republicans are concerned about more than Democrats. Other than that, for all the other issues, generally speaking, Democrats tend to be more concerned about stuff than Republicans. They tend to consider more things a major threat than Republicans do. Okay, moving on. Here we're looking at age, okay? Percent who say each of the following is a major threat to the country by age group, okay? Now, generally speaking, older people tend to be more experienced. They also tend to have more money, but they also tend to have more health problems. And that is something to consider when looking at these numbers. For example, the spread of infectious diseases, the older someone is, the more likely it seems that they'd be worried about it. That makes sense, okay? Now, in terms of the conditions of the global economy, the older someone is, the less they seem to be worried about it, okay? Now, one argument that people present, which I think is a false argument to some extent, is they say, well, older people are richer and that's why they're not so worried about the conditions of the global economy because they have more money. I don't think that's the case because older people are still concerned about their younger children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on. So I think what's more likely, the explanation here, is that they've just seen a lot of economic upswings and downswings and they feel like, well, okay, there could be economic troubles right now and then it'll resolve and then troubles again and it'll resolve again and so on. So that's why I think that's more likely the case why older people tend to be less worried about it. Okay. Now let's go through the other categories here. Okay, so for terrorism, you have the biggest spread here between older people and younger people. Okay, you have the older category goes up to 78% saying it's a major threat, for the younger category down to 42% for the youngest demographic. Now, why this major spread? It could just be that older people have seen more times when there were more terrorist attacks. Right? So they have more of an understanding of what that is, and younger people haven't seen as much, so they don't have as much of an understanding of that. That big gap could also be because of party lines. Now, I'm not sure if this is still the case. In the past, there was this understanding that younger people are lean left and older people lean right. There's some indicators that that's not as much the case anymore. So it's uncertain if that's what's going on here, but if that is a phenomena, well, then that makes sense because Democrats tend to be less concerned about terrorism. Republicans tend to be more concerned about it. So maybe that's what's going on here as well with this spread. Then we have the spread of false information online. We actually see, the dots clumped together on the high end here. So all age groups are pretty concerned about it. But older people are more concerned about it. Okay, so that's interesting. That also paints this picture that this really is an issue, right? Because the more experienced members of the population, well, they tend to be more concerned about spread of false information online. Spread of infectious disease we talked about, conditions of the global economy we talked about. Now, global climate change, we also see older people tend to be less worried about it. Younger people tend to be more worried about it. In general, the dots are clumped kind of in the not as worried part of the spectrum, just like spread of infectious disease. People aren't particularly worried about it. And again, there's a false argument that's made here. People say, oh, older people don't worry about climate change because they're older, they're not going to have to deal with the future as much. Again, I don't think that's a correct argument because older people worry about their children and grandchildren and so on. So they are concerned about the future. I think what's going on here is that older people have just seen other climate-related panics that have happened. There was the ozone layer, the hole in the ozone layer. There was acid rain, which people were concerned about and talking a lot about in the 90s. And then people kind of stopped talking about it as much. The hole in the ozone layer, people stopped talking about it as much. So maybe because older people have seen those phenomena, they feel like, okay, maybe climate change is kind of like that, where it's going to become less of a concern in the future. Maybe that's why they're not as worried about it. The other reason could be the education system. When older people were going through school, pretty much nobody was talking about climate change. People would talk about pollution and the hole in the ozone layer. They wouldn't really talk about climate change though. Whereas younger people going through school, they hear about climate change much more, and that could explain why they're more concerned about it. Now, moving on, so this is partisan views of the threat posed by the global economy and how it shifts over time. So this is very interesting, okay, because you have the Trump and Biden administrations, you have COVID that came into play. So let's follow these data points first. So first, from 2017 up to COVID, everybody agrees. You have percent who say the condition of the global economy is a major threat to the country. You have concern increasing among Democrats. You have concern increasing among Republicans. The concern is increasing more so among Democrats. That makes sense. You have a Republican in office. You also have, from a couple slides below, you see in general Democrats tend to be more worried about stuff, including the condition of the economy. So that the Democratic bar is higher than the Republican bar. Not surprising there. The bars are moving in the same direction. People are getting more concerned. Okay, when COVID hits, you have a bit of a shakeup in early 2020. The Republicans actually become a little less concerned, but very close. The Democrats continue to become more concerned, but very close. But then from there up to the beginning of Biden's term, once you have the data point that's early on in Biden's term, you actually have Democrats less concerned about the global economy, Republicans more concerned about the global economy. The Democratic president is now in the White House. Democrats are less concerned, whereas Republicans are more concerned. Then we fast forward to a data point from 2025. You now have Republicans who are less concerned. You have Democrats who are more concerned. And you have a Republican in the White House. So there seems to be, since after COVID, there seems to be this correlation with who's in the White House. Okay, there really isn't a lot of data points here, but we do seem to see this correlation, right? But before that, before COVID, we see agreement with everybody starting to grow more concerned about the global economy. Now, moving on to the next slide. Okay, so this is interesting. Americans are less likely than people in many other high-income countries to view climate change as a major threat. In fact, in this list of countries, Americans are second last, okay, in terms of what percent of the population views climate change as a major threat. Only 51% of Americans view it as a major threat. The only country who views it as less of a threat than the United States is Israel, where you have 42% who view climate change as a major threat. The median between all of these countries is 66. Okay. Now, here's what's interesting here. Okay. Look at the bottom 5 countries: Israel, United States, Poland, Canada, Australia. These countries, all of them significantly below the median of 66. Okay. The 5 countries least concerned about climate change, they all have very different climates, very different geographies. Okay, you have Australia south of the equator, although not too far south of the equator. You have Canada, a northern country. You have Poland, which is on a sea but almost landlocked, much smaller than Canada and Australia, not as northern as Canada, but kind of northern. You have the United States, more south, most of it, more south than Canada, although not a tropical country, very large country on 2 oceans. Then you have Israel, small, very warm coastal country. So you have very different climates, very different geographies, and they're still the least worried about climate change. Meanwhile, you look at the 5 most worried about climate change: France, Japan, South Korea, Greece, Hungary. Okay, Japan and South Korea, they're both on the same sea, next to the same ocean, you could say comparable size, but then France is has a very different geography. You have Greece that is in some ways comparable to France, but much smaller, much more island based than France, which is more mainland based. You have Hungary, which is landlocked and a much smaller country. So again, pretty different geographies. It's more visible when you look at the 5 countries least worried about climate change. Very different geographies. And what that suggests to us is that geography and climate of a country don't seem to be a significant factor in determining how concerned countries are about climate change. Okay, so they're not thinking, well, how will this affect the climate of my country? No, it seems to be based more on something else, maybe based on ideology, maybe based on other issues the countries are dealing with. So whether climate change is going to climb to being a top issue or not, depending on what else they have to deal with, that seems to be the case here. And that is the poll and what it showed. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I hope you enjoyed that, and until next time.